Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
So today's guest is Julie McFarlane, who is co-founder of Can't Buy My Silence. And as listeners will probably be aware, we've already interviewed Julie as co-founder at Zelda Perkins. Julie is published widely in the areas of self-representation, conflict resolution, mediation and legal practice. Interestingly, she also published her memoir, Going Public, which I found quite a timely read as she described taking on the Anglican Church in the aftermath of abuse. Although she was born and raised in the UK, she now lives and works in Canada. I'm really glad you can join us today, Julie.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Hello, Julie. Very nice to meet you. So, if we can begin, can you tell us how you came to be involved in a legal battle with the Anglican Church?
Well, it started a lot earlier. The actual incidents that led to this were 40 years earlier. Like many survivors of abuse, it took me a very long time to figure out what to do about this. I was a teenager, a member of a church, a Christian church, which had been a very important part of my community, and I felt that I was having doubts about my faith. So I went to my minister and told him I was experiencing doubts, and asked him for his advice. And his advice basically was that I should give him fellatio. Now, I know this sounds completely and totally ridiculous, but I have to set the context a little bit, especially for younger listeners, because there was no internet. I had never seen a penis. I had no idea of such a thing as fellatio, and inconceivable though this might be, the truth or the likelihood of God wanting me to give the minister a blowjob was just not something I could possibly process in my brain. I was being told to do it by someone who was a figure of authority, etc., etc. And I was also very, very scared. This then went on for about 15 months, for the remainder of the time that I lived in that town before I went away to university. And he basically stalked me everywhere. He'd be waiting for me outside the restaurant when I came home from my job as a washer-upper. He'd be hanging around outside the school. He would come to my home and say to my mother he wanted to give me a driving lesson. And I would plead with her not to send me because I had too much homework, but she would, oh, it's so nice of the minister, drag me out. And off we go for a quote unquote driving lesson. When I left, I just tried not to ever go back there again, and certainly never to go back there alone. And then after about 15 years, I started to feel very guilty that I'd not done anything to stop this man doing this, because I was quite certain he'd be still doing it. And so I, again, before the internet, I lived in Hong Kong then, I ordered the Encyclopedia of the Anglican Church, which was this huge book that told you where every single Anglican minister was located in the world. It was astonishing. So it arrives and I look him up, and he's in Australia, in Perth. So it took me another, believe it or not, 10 years to write a statement, which I then sent. They actually had a committee at the Perth Diocese that investigated claims of sexual misconduct against ministers, which was pretty astonishing in the 90s. I finally sent them in a statement, which took me, as I say, the best part of 10 years to actually write that statement. And the action was pretty swift. They believed me. They dismissed him. But unfortunately, the way the churches work, he just went up the road and joined another outlying church and continued to be a minister there. So when I found that out, which I found out, about another 10 years later, and realized he really was still out there, I then decided that it was time to try a lawsuit, which I was very reluctant to do, having spent most of my professional work researching the way that lawsuits impact people and the traumatic impact they have and the little that they often achieve. But I decided this was something I needed to do for other survivors. And by this point, I'd reached the stage of my career where I felt I had some kind of a platform and it would be a useful thing to do. And it would shatter the stereotype that everybody who gets abused is some, ill-educated, poor, broken down person, which is such a stereotype. So I brought the lawsuit. The church ignored us to begin with. And, there was some kind of quite funny moments when they wrote to me and said, no, you don't understand. Our lawyers tell us what to do. We don't have any choice in this matter. We have to defend your lawsuit. To which I wrote back, well, actually, I wrote a book about the fact that you don't have to do that. I'm not really the right person to try that bullshit on. You're in charge. You're the client. And eventually, after I wrote a piece in the Church Times, which they were brave enough to publish under many injunction threats, the church came to the table and settled with us. And my settlement was a new procedure and a new code of practice for dealing with the victims of sexual assault at the insurance company. A few years later, it turned out that another woman had gone forward to police in my hometown when I had the publicity around my case, and she described exactly the same behavior by exactly the same person 40 years earlier. And so now the police were ready to do something, and they actually extradited him from Australia. It was the first ever extradition of a priest for sex crimes from Australia. And he was tried, and in the second trial, he was convicted and imprisoned. That's a summary.
One thing I'd just like to draw attention to, Julie, is that I think would resonate with a lot of people is the amount of time it took you to process and take action. You're a smart, educated woman. You work with the law, and it took you that long to cut. That's not unusual, is it?
Not at all.
To find it can take that long to actually do something to try and redress the wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it's astonishing now to think of just how long that took, but it is typical. And I think the other thing that's interesting about the background that I have been part of this is that, I'd spent years as an empirical researcher talking to people about their awful experiences of the justice system, primarily on the civil side. But I had never, despite the fact I'd listened to all those stories for all those years and written so much about it, until I went through it myself, even though I had the enormous privilege of the knowledge that I had, I could never have anticipated just how awful it really was and how much it re-triggers all the feelings of shame and self-doubt, and having to explain things that are so difficult to understand. So it was a really difficult experience. And I think one of my lessons was, I always thought that I understood the trauma that people experience going through the legal system, trying to assert their rights, but I didn't until it happened to me. Not really.
That's a very graphic account, Julie, of all those years where you were experiencing and processing those experiences. But you mentioned that there was this kind of intersection between your professional life and these personal events. What exactly were you doing, and do you think that empowered you to eventually take the action that you did take?
Well, I think that unconsciously, and it was unconscious, I was kind of preparing myself with the knowledge and the experience that I would need in order to do this. But I was doing it through other people's stories, not my own. At the time, I don't think I made the connection. I was obviously drawn to work with people who were being marginalized, people who were being treated unfairly. Really, all my work has been around different issues that relate to access to justice. And I've been, thorn in the side of the legal profession and not necessarily the most popular person. But I think unknowingly, I was kind of preparing myself with, the means that I could do something about my own shit. But it took me a long time, I think, to realize that there was a connection there. But there clearly was. I mean, one of the jobs I did at the time was working for the organization that campaigned to abolish corporal punishment in schools in the UK, which we achieved. We achieved a change in the law both for state schools and also one that was especially close to my heart for the private school sector, where abuse is often so rampant. Looking back now, it's obvious that I was connecting to these experiences that I was getting told all the time by parents, which were often sexual abuse as well as physical. But it never occurred to me. But I think I was unintentionally kind of equipping myself with the strategies and with the knowledge that I would eventually do something about this.
Thank you very much. So, Julie, what's it been like more recently for you to see what's been going on in the Church of England, as it happens, regarding Justin Welby and, of course, others?
Well, it's kind of like, here we go again. I mean, the kind of slightly funny thing about the whole Justin Welby resignation is that Zelda and I had been talking about the possibility that he would resign for weeks. Zelda was very on it, and she was saying, I think maybe you should write, more on a personal level than on the level of our campaign to restrict non-disclosure agreements. And so that was hard to do. Another thing that was, surprisingly hard to do. It took me a while, but I did get it together, and I did put a letter together, and I was just at the point of pressing send on that email to the Archbishop's office, where my daughter, who lives in England, messaged me to say, he's resigned. I was like, shit. I was just about to press send, and I was like, whatever, send. I sent it anyway. And I got a response which was actually kind of hilarious, because first of all, I'm sure that they got hundreds, if not thousands, of letters. And I got a response almost immediately. So I obviously still have a red flag on my file. And the response, was pathetic again. It just said, oh, yes, we're so sorry. All the things that, they've been saying to survivors for years. Oh, we're so sorry. We're so sorry. We can't do anything about it, but we're so sorry. Well, you're not sorry if you don't do something about it when you have the power, which there was, to do something about it. So I think that it feels, and I'm in touch with a lot of other Anglican Church survivors in the UK still, I think it feels like something that had to happen, but we have to wait and see what happens next. I mean, the idea that we're still waiting for the UK to implement the J Committee, the ICSA committee proposal that reporting child abuse should be mandatory, and that applies to priests as well as other professionals. I mean, it's just extraordinary in the 21st century that we're even having this conversation. We need to take that away from the church. They no longer should be dealing with their own safeguarding. They have shown themselves to be completely inadequate to do it. But, we're waiting for that legislation still.
And the story goes on, of course, because then Justin Welby made the, what's the right word? I could say iconic, I could say classic, I could say archetypal, sorry but not sorry, in the House of Lords.
Right. Yes, yeah. But what happened to me, and I did have correspondence with his office at the time, and correspondence just like the correspondence that was talked about in the John Smith case, where, he was informed that the police were now prepared to charge this person. He'd already been terminated from the Anglican Church position in Australia. It would be so easy for them to have accepted responsibility, and they just weren't prepared to do anything about it.
So, Julie, you mentioned you're perhaps not the most popular member of your profession, among the profession. So what's it like to be an academic lawyer studying the aggressive practices of other parts of your industry? Is there a personal cost to this?
Well, I mean, forget the personal cost for a moment. I think that I became convinced very quickly after I accidentally became a law professor in the early 1980s, early 1980s, that it was very important to change the way that we taught lawyers, because that was the only way that we changed the legal profession. And, quite why I was so convinced of this, aged, 23, I'm not really quite sure, but I sure was convinced. And so I've always felt that what I did in the law school, first in Ireland, and then I worked in the United Kingdom, then in Hong Kong, then in Canada, and I've had visiting positions in lots of other places in Asia and Australia. I always felt that what I did was very counterculture, and I was very conscious of that. I mean, it was not my objective to persuade law students not to practice law, but it certainly was my objective to prepare them to practice law with a different point of view. And, for a while, less so now, For a while, I felt that that was a really important and effective way to change the way that legal services were delivered. But what I can say is, having spent all those years as a law professor, a total of almost 40 years I was a law professor, that nothing has really changed that dramatically in that period. I think the impact that the work I've done and a few others has been minimal. And we still really kind of educate lawyers in the same way that we were educating them 50 years ago. You know, there's a lot of noise about social justice and so forth, but there is an inevitable pull towards money making in the legal profession, which is sustained by the way that it originated and developed. And it's very difficult once a young lawyer gets into the profession, it's very difficult to resist the urge to make more money, which is generally the result of being very adversarial.
Thank you. But isn't it very hard doing what you do? I mean, I know barristers are trained and expected to fight battles, but I feel that the kind of things you engaged in were of a different kind of caliber.
Well, I mean, I think that something that people do learn if they're trained in law is that there are lots of things that are a matter of principle. The real issue becomes, do those principles come before other kinds of goals, like, making as much money as possible, having a really good reputation, towing the line in a very conservative profession. I mean, insofar as I was not towing the line as a law professor, I was doing things that were certainly unusual in my classroom around trying to develop a sense of not just critical thinking, but actual strategies to work with clients and ways to work with real people that respected their differences and the fact that they would be impacted in a traumatic way by the legal system. I mean, even just that assumption is still seen as a kind of a radical part of training people for practice. I mean, it just seemed to me that it was so obvious and it had to be done that way. And I don't think I can feel, that I took some kind of courageous stand. It was just the only way that I could think about doing this work. I did lose a few jobs, in my earlier days. I lost one job directly because of my corporal punishment work, because I was on TV a lot talking about it, because the then Chancellor of a university in London, who had appointed me to a position just after I'd had my first child, he revoked the position because he disagreed with what I said about corporal punishment, which was pretty amazing. And I've had another 2 experiences where basically I was vetoed by somebody much higher up in the university because I was seen as being a dangerous feminist. So, it's come back and bitten me. And then my final experience, of course, when I discovered there was a non-disclosure agreement being used to secretly send one of my colleagues who had been terminated for relentless and horrendous sexual harassment of students. When I discovered the non-disclosure agreement was being used to send him to another law school in secret, and I spoke up about it, nobody else spoke up in my law school. And I think that was probably the hardest moment of all. I was by then, completely established in my career. It wasn't about worrying about losing my job. I'd just been made a member of the Order of Canada. I was this silly title, distinguished university professor, blah, blah. But I couldn't believe that they would do this. I also couldn't believe that after I spoke up and told the truth about the circumstances of his termination, that they allowed me to be sued by him in Trinidad for defamation successfully, because they just hid behind the NDA. I mean, that's a pretty astonishing thing for a university to do. They threw me completely and totally under the bus. And I also had, I'm a cancer patient, and at the time I was very ill, and I think that they thought that I wasn't long for this world. I think they thought it would all be sorted out because I just died, but I didn't. So quite honestly, that has been the hardest, even though that's the most recent, and I was not, in an insecure place at the time, because it's so hard for people to talk about NDAs when they're in precarious employment or very minimal income. I didn't have those challenges, but I did have the challenge of being basically completely isolated and abandoned by my colleagues, which still shocks me to say that.
Yeah, it's shocking but not surprising. Unfortunately, we've had quite a few whistleblowers on who've spoken about the sort of the isolation and that sense of betrayal. Quite often, if other people had been able to stand up too, it would have
Oh,
made
completely.
the whistleblower less vulnerable because there'd have been
Oh, yeah.
strength in numbers. So
If
yeah, very
one
difficult.
person, just one other person, had stood up and corroborated, and everybody knew it was true, what I'd said, he wouldn't have sued me. Now, it's not such a big deal, it turns out, to have a defamation order against you in Trinidad. They're not, I mean, this was another advantage that I had here. I could actually figure this out. I was getting at one point letters to the house all the time saying, we're going to take you home. And, I kept talking about it. So, you're in contempt and blah, blah, blah. But there's no reciprocal jurisdiction between Canada and Trinidad, which means there's no direct enforcement. So it does mean I can't go to Trinidad for a holiday, which is too bad because I've quite a few Trini friends and it looks really nice. But other than that, it's not that big a deal. But it does show us the lengths that employers are willing to go to hide what they think is going to damage their reputations.
Yeah,
Quite
absolutely.
astonishing.
So what training do lawyers have in ethical practices and decision making, Julie? Any?
They are always trained. There's always a course called legal ethics. It's part of every law school's curriculum. It's part of what you have to have shown to have taken and passed to pass the bar in Canada and in the United States and in the United Kingdom. But the substance of that course is rules, because the substance of all courses at law school are rules. They're not about people. They're not about conflicts. They're about rules, which is a big part of the problem. And the rules of ethics are contained in the professional codes of practice. They don't actually examine the really hard ethical situations that people face. What do you do when you feel that your client is arguing a hopeless case to try to argue them out of it? What do you do when they want you to spend money that you feel is not going to be well spent? What do you do when they're turning down an offer that you feel might be the best offer they're going to get? I mean, there are so many complex questions about working with people in conflict, and absolutely none of these are talked about in a realistic way. And so, yes, like most things in law school, in theory, they learn about ethics, but in terms of actual practical human relationships and their own personal decision making and reflection, which is what I try to encourage students to develop, no, they don't get that.
Yeah, it's perhaps not surprising. And you can hear your sort of strong sense of personal integrity kind of like contributed to the setting up of Can't Buy My Silence with Zelda Perkins. Lawyers are so often involved in setting in place arrangements that leave people feeling traumatised and stifled. So what's going wrong? How do some lawyers heading up and end up heading down this path?
Well, I'm unfortunately at the moment, not just some, but most. We're beginning to see the profession give itself a shake about non-disclosure agreements, and I think both in Canada and in the UK. And I think that's coming from the fact that they're getting really bad press about them. I mean, it's really beginning to stain the reputation of the profession. There is clearly, and we know this from the research that we have collected in the last 3.5 years, there is clearly very little room for actual choice here. I mean, one of the arguments that gets made all the time in favor of NDAs is, oh, they give survivors choice. Well, if you actually said that to someone who's been coerced into an NDA, they would literally laugh in your face or they would cry, because people are told that this is effectively a requirement, which is not true. It's totally inaccurate, which is why part of our strategy at Can't Buy My Silence, just like it was for me with some of my earlier projects, was to give people the knowledge to know that they didn't have to sign an NDA, to know that wasn't a requirement, in order that they could have, a little bit of pushback, because knowledge is power. So we don't see them as a matter of choice. If you think about it as well, I mean, this isn't hard law. This is the other thing that I find really kind of amazing and ironic about this. If you make an agreement between two parties, the issue is, can you have a non-disclosure agreement, a permanent ban on speaking in there? Well, the way a non-disclosure agreement works is that the survivor is told you can only have your privacy and confidentiality, which obviously people very much want, if you also agree to give privacy and confidentiality to the perpetrator / organization / employer. I call it a reciprocal transaction. That's what it is. Now, common sense will tell you don't need to be a lawyer that sometimes when you negotiate, one side wants one thing and one side wants the other. And most negotiations are a trade-off. And I know this because I was a mediator, a workplace mediator for years and years. So it's perfectly possible to give a one-sided confidentiality agreement to a survivor, but they're not told that this is an option. And their lawyers just throw their hands up and say, oh no, everybody expects an NDA. Well, if you stop saying yes to it, then they can't have it. And what we've seen in all the jurisdictions where this has now been restricted, which is now 27 US states, as well as some parts of UK law and one province in Canada, and an Ireland, and there's other countries moving towards this now, where they have restricted non-disclosure agreements. There's this big fear that nothing will ever settle again, nobody will ever make a deal. It's absolute bullshit. Things continue to settle just like they always did. It's just this particular toy is taken off the table and put away in a box and it can't be used any longer. And I've actually tracked the settlement rates in US states post legislation, and it's 11% higher when there's an NDA legislation than before. And the reason for that is obvious to us, although everybody in the profession is like scratching their heads. The reason's obvious. People are pushing back. People are not making deals because they now are aware of what an NDA does, and they're infuriated and they push back.
So can I follow up on that, Julie, and perhaps be a bit of a devil's advocate? Because certainly in my experience, I've suffered some pretty awkward situations myself, but more particularly, I've observed people I've been working with really suffer from a health authority's position that they weren't going to offer agreements, including non-disclosure agreements, because they felt they couldn't offer non-disclosure. So what that led them to do was to be even more punitive and to search every nook and cranny, every article of whatever this person may have done or written to prove poor behaviour or dishonest behaviour. Do you think there's any possibility that agencies might go down that road?
Not quite following, David. Could you kind of say it again? So if they said they wouldn't use NDAs and they wouldn't use any kind of confidentiality to protect the victim, so in order to protect their own reputation, they did a lot more investigation to try to prove that it really was.
Yes. So rather than offer a settlement, including an NDA, they instead, they enforced really unsatisfactory working conditions. They searched this person's record in order to find out whether they'd ever done anything wrong, and they used that as a means to eventually simply fire him.
So they were trying to stain the reputation of the complainant.
That's right, you put it perfectly.
Right. And this was before there was an investigation.
So there would have been investigations, but investigations take many forms, don't they?
Right. I think we in Can't Buy My Silence, we're really targeting non-disclosure agreements because they are a kind of building block of a lot of very exploitative statements that harm people. But there are so many other pieces to the workplace investigation process that are really troubling. I remember one evening, unfortunately made the mistake of writing a list of all the things that still needed to be fixed with workplace investigations once we'd fixed the NDA problem. And it was a long list. It was depressing. So, I'm not really quite aware of the circumstances that you're describing, David, but it sounds as if this is, another way in which workplace investigations need to be regulated. People who do them need to be accredited. This is, a private justice system that is increasingly used far more than the public justice system. And so we need to have transparency, we need to have integrity, and we need to have some kind of regulation. I feel very strongly it can't be damaged by permanent gags, because otherwise people can never speak about their experiences again. But there are still ways, as I said, to protect the complainant without protecting the perpetrator. And, I think that it's increasingly starting to be clear to a lot of corporations that their reputation is being so damaged by being discovered to be hiding things, that they need to get ahead of this, and they need to own their perpetrators. And I think that's starting to happen, because if you own the fact that there's a perpetrator and you're going to do something about it, it looks an awful lot better for a glass door review than it does if you simply got rid of the complainant and NDA'd them.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Naomi, I was taking Julie down a
No, it's interesting.
rabbit hole there.
Think about it some more.
Thank you.
Good.
But Julie, do you have whistleblowing lawyers in Canada? Because we interviewed Ari Yampolsky, who's a whistleblowing lawyer from the US on the podcast previously, and there's, I suppose, opinions on that seem to be quite divided in the UK. I wondered what your thoughts were.
Well, we certainly have whistleblowing laws and whistleblowing lawyers here. They vary. They are, by province in the same way they vary in the US by state. They are almost entirely limited in Canada to the public sector. We have very weak whistleblowing laws. They're not exclusively public sector in some provinces, but they are primarily public sector. So they are quite an inadequate layer of coverage. The other issue, of course, that we've been struggling with at Can't Buy My Silence about whistleblowing, and we've said from the very get-go, is that the fact that whistleblowing laws can't be overridden by NDAs is pretty clear. But the real problem is that people don't know what their whistleblowing rights are. It's the same problem that it always is. It comes back to lack of knowledge.
And do you think any of the training that you provide within your department might be considered unusual and might help overcome some of these problems?
Well, basically what we're trying to do at the moment at the Canadian side of Can't Buy My Silence is do both information sessions, which we just did one yesterday. They're like an hour long. They're kind of the law of non-disclosure agreements 101, trying to show people how, relatively simple it is to understand this and what they might do as a matter of strategy, and how they might help other people who are being faced with non-disclosure agreements. I think that is very useful work because it's equipping people like on the front lines who are going to be hearing from people who've been presented with NDAs with some tools to give them advice. Now, of course, the underlying problem is that if you've been asked to sign an NDA, you're not supposed to talk about that either. So, this is an absolutely fantastically effective process for keeping people quiet. But I think the more it's apparent that legal advice and other sort of women's agencies and other agencies that work with immigrants, with disabled people, once it's clear that their clients are going to be facing signing NDAs, then people will start to ask. There'll be more encouragement for them to come forward. So I think this, even if we, get legislation through all over the world, which I believe we will eventually, you're still going to need that public awareness and that kind of frontline knowledge.
Sounded as though you were also in your team thinking about trauma and how that shows up in court and the legal process.
Very much so. And I've written about this a lot in the past. Pretty much everybody who's in the legal system, certainly if they're self-representing, is experiencing some kind of PTSD. And, those are very clear impacts on people who have to struggle on their own in the legal system. People who say they can never walk down the street with the court building in it any longer, that they had to get rid of their computer and get a new one once their case was over. All kinds of really obvious signs. And that was why I started the National Self-Represented Litigants Project earlier, to try to, explain and present to the legal profession and to the judiciary that these are regular people. And if they behave in an upset or distressed way, it's because they're upset and distressed because of the legal system. They're not trying to ruin your day. They also don't wake up in the morning and think, oh, great, I get to be a lawyer today. People are doing this because they can't afford a lawyer. And the numbers in the UK are very similar to Canada. The most recent report in the UK estimated that 80% of people in the British public couldn't afford to pay a lawyer beyond, the first few times of meeting. So, we've created a system now that is only available to 20% of people. And then we're surprised when people show up on their own and don't necessarily do everything right in court. Well, we need to get real about that.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, David, I'm going to just nip in here, but you told me some really interesting facts about the origins of law as a practice. How has that shaped this system?
Well, it's hard to know. The fact is that law began as an unpaid profession. It began as something that people of independent means and wealth would do as a favor. It was always free to somebody whose cause they believed in, I guess. It was only in the 1800s, in the later 1800s, that we actually started to have proper training and the system of apprenticeship became articles and so forth. So this transition to a fee-paying model, which obviously is a practical one, I always feel still kind of reflects a little bit of that largesse, that kind of feeling of charity, like you're lucky to have me. And that has really contributed to, and this is common in other professions, a very sort of patriarchal, bossy culture inside the legal profession. Lawyers have this expression about, getting instructions. I need to get instructions from my client. But as one lawyer told me so poignantly years ago, when we say getting instructions from our client, what we actually mean is telling them what to do. And I think that's starting to change. I think that Generation Z has a whole different idea of how it might be to work collaboratively with somebody who might want to do some pieces themselves to save themselves the costs of it. But that is still a very counterintuitive way to work for people who qualified, of my generation. So I remain hopeful that this is going to change, but it needs to. It needs to change because at the moment, not only do lawyers serve very few people, but they haven't really thought about how they can serve more people if they change their approach to what this service model really should look like.
So just to pick up that interesting little description there, and you were talking about getting instructions, lawyers getting instructions, really telling people what to do. Isn't it telling people what to do in a particular way which leaves the individual responsible for making the decision?
Well, I mean, certainly any lawyer would tell you, and this is also part of the ethics and code of conduct, that it should be the client that makes the final decision, which was what made the Archbishop of Canterbury's office so hilarious, constantly declaring that they had no control over the lawyers. But, how much it's really that person's decision is very hard to know. And I mean, I'm not going to minimize how complex this is. I mean, if we sort of take away the stereotype of the adversarial lawyer and just think of the lawyer as the person who helps navigate somebody through a justice system, a rule-based system, it's a really hard job. It's a job that you ought to be given training on how to work with people who are already traumatized, won't necessarily always be their best selves, will have good days and bad days. And there's really nothing yet that really sees that as an integral part of lawyer training, which was what I was trying in a somewhat clumsy, unqualified way to do. I mean, I could see the gap. I wasn't necessarily the best person to fill it, but I could certainly see the gap, and the gap is still there.
Thank you. And you've hinted at this already, but how far would you say the system is stacked against the individual?
It's very hard. It's very, very hard indeed. I mean, I meet people who are extraordinarily smart and brilliant at trying to navigate this on their own. It's not about, any lack of effort or diligence. And at the National Self-Represented Litigants Project, we began, and it still runs, we think it's the first ever in the world school for self-represented litigants, where we would, help them and school them through some of these steps. But it's incredibly hard to succeed as an individual because you're not just having to navigate the rules and the procedure, but you're also in a culture that is not welcoming to you. The culture accepts lawyers as experts. The whole system is designed to be driven by a lawyer as an expert. If there isn't a lawyer, it starts to kind of fall to pieces. And people who find themselves in that situation, will occasionally find a lawyer who would be willing to coach them and help them, or maybe a court clerk who will be sympathetic. But usually what they're doing is swimming upstream. I remember one self-represented litigant telling me that going to court as a self-rep was like going to a gunfight armed only with a small kitchen knife. And I think that's, it's a little bloodthirsty, but it's quite a good metaphor.
Thank you. So finally, you're deeply involved in work that brings a focus on some of the darker aspects of society and our institutions. How have you looked after your own well-being, your own love of life during this time?
Well, what I have to recognize now, I'm in my 60s, is that the work I do has always, and this is a little bit back to our earlier theme, has always helped me have meaning in life. I wasn't aware of it in the same way when I was younger, although I was very driven, but I wasn't really thinking hard about why. I think that a lot of my younger years, I was in, survival mode. And that meant that I kind of gravitated towards situations where I saw other individuals in survival mode. And I think now, although, if my grandchildren lived in the same country as me, this could be different. But I think now I am very accepting of the fact that what I want to keep doing, despite the fact that I'm sick and, will continue to be, it's an important way of keeping my hope in the world. I'm someone who is very pragmatic. I mean, I've written and thought a lot in very conceptual and theoretical terms over the years, but I'm at heart a very pragmatic person. And I think that just getting something changed and something made better, or one person's situation improved, or being there for someone when they haven't had anybody before who's been there for them, that gives me a lot of meaning. And I think that, although it also wears me out, translates into hope and meaning in my own life.
Thank you. Having meaning in life, that's a tremendous way to end this conversation. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you, Julie.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I hope this was okay.